I got into an interesting discussion with a viewer about language, mathematics, and reality, and I felt like this was a topic worth exploring more fully in a video. So I'm going to share a part of the conversation, and then respond and elaborate on the subject. Christine shared a quote from someone known as who says, "You cannot link words to the unmediated expression of something non-linguistic, to an emotion, sensation, sense datum, physical object, idea, or Platonic form. You can, however, link numbers to exactly these. Every number is, ontologically, an energy wave, and every wave carries information, content, meaning, experience. By combining numbers, waves, we can create an infinite number of different experiences. We can think in terms of atomic experiences that we combine in various ways to form molecular experiences. The atomic experiences are eternal and necessarily fixed, but the molecular experiences are temporal and contingent. The atomic experiences are akin to the notes of a piano. The molecular experiences are like the music we play with the notes." Christine asked me, "Do you see the beauty of those words?" I began my response by saying, "The quote you shared by definitely resonates with me. I agree with what he said, at least in general, and yet I challenge him to write an equation on a chalkboard and produce a loaf of bread from it. I have no doubt that a sufficiently talented mathematician could completely describe the physical structure of a loaf of bread down to the subatomic level, and could probably even convert the sense experience of the taste and texture into some kind of mathematical wave form. But it would still only be a description, and not the thing itself. In the same way that the word bread is merely a description. This is even more true when we speak of mind, spirit, or consciousness. I certainly see mind as mathematical in its structure. But I don't think it's right to say either that mathematics creates mind or that mind creates mathematics. Although if I have to choose either or, I'd lean toward the latter. It doesn't seem right to me to say simply that what we call mind is identical with what we call mathematics either. I'm tempted to say that ontological mathematics is the objective representation of mind as it manifests itself to itself as a self-concept. I apologize for my almost Hegelian grammatic structure here, but I think I've succeeded in expressing a difficult thought. I half agree with Hegelian's dual-aspect monism, as I understand it. It's hard to explain my point of contention, but I would say it's an epistemological disagreement, and not so much an ontological one. Rather than attempting to awkwardly use his terminology, I'll use my own. It seems to me that he's basically describing a kind of imagined duality, where on one hand you have the mind-independent thing in itself, and on the other you have the mind-dependent mental representation of the thing in itself. At about this point in my reply, I realized that I was dealing with ideas that are far too complex and nuanced to be adequately addressed in the comments section. So I decided to make a full-length video response, especially since I think that what I have to say on the topic might be of interest to a broader audience, and is almost guaranteed to piss off some people, which is also fun. Let me back up a little bit and give a little bit of background for the benefit of anyone who's new to my channel and who has no idea what we're talking about, which is most people. Dual-aspect monism is kind of a compromise between absolute monism and absolute dualism. It postulates that the mental and the physical are two aspects of the same substance. One advocate of this theory is a writer who has published an impressive body of work under the pseudonym In his version of dual-aspect monism, Mathematics is seen as the underlying reality that expresses itself in both a mental and a physical aspect. He describes this in terms of the frequency domain and the space-time domain, and reconciles the two via Fourier transforms. Although I'm somewhat familiar with his ideas, I'm not sure whether I understand them well enough to accurately represent them. So I want to offer a disclaimer here and state that I'm discussing the ideas of dual aspect theory and the mathematical universe in a general way. My critique isn't aimed specifically at Hawking's model and may or may not apply to it. I just want to state that clearly so I'm not accused of misrepresenting anyone or attacking straw men. And I encourage anyone who's interested in these topics to read by me. But let me offer a critique of the dual aspect theory and offer an alternative perspective. Picking up where I left off in my initial reply, I feel like ontological questions hinge on epistemological questions. Ontological questions deal with what is, while epistemological questions deal with what is known. Of course, obviously, what we can say about what is limited by our knowledge of what is known. So questions about the nature of reality are really questions about our knowledge of reality. Metaphysical questions are phenomenological questions. Let me give a simple illustration before moving into some very difficult concepts. If you look at the flame of a candle, the flame, as you experience it, is a mental phenomenon. It exists within your mind. It is a mental representation. If someone shoots you in the head and splatters your brains all over the wall, most people will agree that your mental representation of the flame is extinguished. But the candle itself still burns. The mental image of the flame that exists in your mind is a representation. It is mind-dependent. The flame that we assume exists, whether you perceive it or not, is the thing in itself. It is believed to be mind-independent. I've used these terms before, and will use them again in the course of this discussion. And I hope this simple illustration helps to clarify what I mean by these terms, for anyone who finds them confusing. Moving on, anyone who wants to defend an ontological position that includes any sort of mind-independent something is faced with a seemingly impossible epistemological challenge. How can you ever know that something exists which is mind-independent? In my experience, it takes a while for even an intelligent person to fully grasp the seriousness and significance of this challenge. So forgive me if I labor the point a bit. This is absolutely crucial. You are a conscious being. You are a mind. You can't be absolutely certain that you exist as a physical being simply because you perceive yourself as having a physical body. After all, what you believe to be your physical body when you dream turns out to be merely a mental projection. To describe this phenomenon in more precise terms, your unconscious mind generates the mental image of your physical body within the dream, and your conscious mind within the dream perceives the unconsciously generated mental image. So you don't experience yourself as the creator of the image. It seems to you that you are this image. You are your body. And it seems to you, while you're dreaming, that what you perceive as physical objects are mind independent, when in fact they are mind generated. It seems to you that they would exist whether you perceive them or not. And of course, there's no reason why the unconscious mind, which generates the dream world, can't generate a dream world that creates the illusion of object permanence. If you dream that you're running from a monster, for example, is the monster still behind you when you're running away from it? You turn around and see that it's still chasing you. But what about when you aren't looking? My position is that yes, it is still there. Because your unconscious mind is creating a reality in which the monster is chasing you, and your consciousness is experiencing itself within that unconsciously generated reality. So we have to ask ourselves whether what we call reality is generated by an unconscious universal mind. What I'm describing isn't the same as Jung's collective unconscious, but what he calls the collective unconscious can be thought of as arising out of it and being generated by it, along with what we call the material universe. This unconscious universal mind can be thought of as roughly analogous to the ignorant creator god, who is called the demiurge in Gnostic mythology. But the one thing within the created universe, which is uncreated, is consciousness. Unconsciousness cannot create consciousness. Surely no one will claim that the conscious, dreaming self, which experiences the dream, is the creation of the unconscious mind which generates the dream. The unconscious mind only generates the false identity, which the conscious self mistakes for its true self within the dream. But the conscious self itself, which becomes identified with the false dream self, existed before the dream, and will continue to exist after the dream. No one can object to this. But of course, some will reject the notion that the same is true in a macrocosmic sense. It's difficult to accept that what we call the material universe is essentially a mentally generated dream world generated by the universal unconscious, and that who we believe we are is a false self, which is also the creation of the demiurge. But our true self is eternal and uncreated. This is the truth concealed in the Gnostic myth. This is the secret revealed through illumination. Let's continue to illuminate this secret teaching by way of the dream analogy. We can see that the conscious mind and the unconscious mind are not separate entities, but are two aspects of the same mind. In order for there to be consciousness, there must be something like a mind which is conscious. But consciousness is merely one state in which mind can exist. Mind can also exist in a state of unconsciousness. In examining our own minds, we observe that our minds fluctuate between consciousness and unconsciousness. I'm only applying the Hermetic principle of correspondence when I say that the same is true of the macrocosm as is true of the microcosm. But of course, there's an intermingling of consciousness and unconsciousness. While we're asleep, our conscious mind becomes a slave to the unconscious mind in a sense, although the conscious mind can learn to master the unconscious mind and control the dream world, at least to some extent, as we see in lucid dreaming. While we're awake, we might expect the opposite to be the case. We might expect the unconscious mind to become a slave to the conscious mind. But is this what we actually see? No. On the contrary, we see that people are mostly controlled by unconscious impulses and desires. This is to say, they are slaves to the demiurge. The Gnostic path of illumination and liberation involves learning to strengthen one's will in order to overcome one's unconscious impulses and desires and harness the power of the unconscious to accomplish one's true will. This is the secret of magic, and what is meant by the stories of magicians who learn to command demons. The man who has not learned to command demons allows those same demons to rule over him. They are the archons. When the majority of men and women are slaves to the archons effectively rule the world. But they rule the world through their human puppets, who others have referred to as the satanic ruling elite, the ancient regime, or the old world order. Their power comes from the archons, and ultimately from the demiurge, which is why they are evil from the perspective of the enlightened Gnostics. Of course, the enlightened ones, or the Illuminati, are seen as a threat to the power of the demiurge, his archons, and their human puppets. This is because if enough men and women become enlightened, then the kingdom of the universal unconscious will fall under the control of the kingdom of the universal consciousness, which can be thought of as the true God of the Gnostics. However, if you understand what I've said, it will be obvious to any intelligent person that this goal cannot be accomplished through political revolution, but only through a mass revolution of consciousness. This is why I've been so critical of people who focus on political or statist solutions to what is fundamentally a spiritual problem. You have to understand that the elites are given power by the archons, but this power isn't given to them from above. It's given to them from below. It's given to them by the masses of men and women who are slaves to the archons. It is through the consent of the governed that those who govern, govern. Even if some revolutionary movement led by enlightened men and women succeeded in overthrowing the puppets of the archons and seizing power, they would immediately be overthrown and replaced by a mass counter-revolutionary movement, because the masses of mind-controlled men and women do not want to be liberated. I know that's difficult for some to accept, but it's the truth. Once you understand that the puppets of the archons, who some refer to as the old world order or the satanic ruling elite, are given their power by the masses of men and women who are controlled directly by the archons, you see the futility of fighting the puppets in order to liberate the masses. Even the cruelest tyrant dances to the tune of the mob and is merely a servant who carries out their will, which is ultimately the will of the archons who control the mass of humanity. The masses are not oppressed and never have been. They live in a prison which they themselves have constructed under the direction of the archons whom they serve. And as long as they serve the archons, they will attack anyone who attempts to free them from the prison they've chosen of their own free will. The battle for this world, if it is to be won, must be fought on the battlefield of the mind of each individual. Young, naive idealists will say that I'm giving in to a pessimistic, defeatist attitude when I say this, but I am extremely skeptical of the belief that the battle for the soul of humanity can be won at the collective level. The esoteric tradition has always held that illumination is not for the many, but for the few. We see this conviction in sayings such as, "Narrow is the path that leads to salvation, and few are those who find it. And wide is the gate that leads to destruction, and many are those who pass through it." And the Eastern traditions also teach that the path of salvation is difficult, like passing along a razor's edge. The battle for this world is a losing battle. This world belongs to its creator. Jesus insisted that his kingdom is not of this world. His salvation seems to be about delivering the Gnostic from this world, rather than delivering this world to the Gnostic. But of course, this is contrasted with the vision found in the book of Revelation, in which Christ does in fact return to reign over this world of darkness. So which is it? Is his kingdom of this world, or isn't it? I obviously am not someone who believes in a literal interpretation of the Bible, but even a Gnostic interpretation offers some difficulty. And I think this reflects a long-standing dispute within the secret societies, which is a source of division to this very day, and is still very relevant. And I think this dispute hinges on an even more fundamental dispute over the most basic metaphysical question that I introduced earlier. So if anyone thought I had gone off on a tangent, I hope you can see that what appeared to be a tangent was in reality actually the circumference of a much larger circle, which contains the first, and whose radius is many times larger than the diameter of the first. It seems to me that all political ideologies rest on implicit metaphysical presuppositions. I see a correlation between the conflict theory within sociology and the dualist theory within metaphysics, for example. As above, so below. The same mind that perceives political reality in terms of conflict perceives metaphysical reality in dualistic terms. The mind which perceives metaphysical reality in terms of pure monism will probably also tend to approach socio-political issues from a functionalist perspective. The mind which attempts to synthesize pure monism and pure dualism into some kind of dual aspect monism will almost inevitably produce a similar political ideology that seeks to synthesize conflict theory and functionalism, or to synthesize Marxism with capitalism. I believe that an enlightened mind perceives neither duality nor unity, but paradox. As a consequence of this, I reject both monism and dualism. I reject the notion that reality is one or the other, or both, or neither, in much the same way that Parmenides, the great Pythagorean philosopher, did. Because Parmenides lived so close to the time of Pythagoras, and because he was so highly respected by the early Pythagoreans, it seems likely that his teaching, as recorded by Plato, is probably an accurate reflection of the secret metaphysical teachings of Pythagoras himself. So even if someone says my position is wrong, they can't say it isn't rooted in the ancient and authentic tradition of the Pythagorean Brotherhood. But as someone who's critical of authority, I'm not hypocritically making an appeal to authority here. Maybe Pythagoras was wrong. So let me offer a rational critique of the idea of dual aspect theory. It isn't my intention to insult or offend anyone who may hold or promote such a view. I'm a critic of all ideologies, including my own. Like the ancient Hindu sages, my mantra is neti neti. I'm an apophatic theologian. Let's begin by assuming a dual aspect model, similar to that proposed by Contra. I say similar to, because I'm concerned that I may not accurately represent his views, and I don't want to be accused of attacking straw men. I'm simply addressing a general model in which reality at the most basic level is mathematical, and in which mathematical reality expresses itself in two aspects. On one hand, it expresses itself in a dimensionless mental frequency domain, and on the other, it expresses itself in a dimensional, physical, space-time domain. Before we get into any incredibly complicated and technical discussions related to Fourier transforms or Euler's identity, let me play the part of the fool, which, I admit, is a part that I find myself most naturally suited to play. It seems to me that when we speak of the dimensional, physical, space-time domain, we're basically just talking about the world we experience. We're talking about the reality that presents itself to our senses. To put it another way, we're talking about the world as we perceive it to be. We're talking about the world as mental representation. Or, from the perspective of a naive realist, we're simply talking about the natural world. But as I've pointed out, what we call physical objects are just mental representations. We know that they exist in our minds, but we simply assume that these mental representations correspond to some mind-independent reality. We can never prove this. It also seems to me that when we speak of a dimensionless mental frequency domain, we're basically just talking about an abstract conceptualization of the world as a thing in itself, which exists as a mind-independent reality. But of course, this so-called reality is only an abstract conceptualization, which exists within our minds. Like the candle flame I alluded to earlier, we simply assume that this abstract conceptualization, which exists within our minds, corresponds to some kind of mind-independent reality that exists apart from our mental perception of it. Again, we can never prove this. I find it similarly impossible to defend the claim that mathematics exist independently of mind. And by that I mean the notion that mathematics exist independently of the universal mind. How could the universal mind itself ever know this? To me, it seems far more rational to say that the laws of mathematics are part of the nature and structure of the universal mind, than to claim that they somehow exist apart from or outside of the universal mind. I also challenge the notion of a space-time domain. It seems to me that space and time are mental experiences. So what he calls the dimensional, physical, space-time domain, at least as far as it is knowable, is really just a set of mental experiences that exist within consciousness. If you dream of looking up at the night sky, what is the mass and volume of the moon you dream you see? What is the distance between that moon and the earth you dream you're standing on? How much time does it take the light you dream you see reflected from that moon to travel to the earth? When we're talking about a dream, what meaning does time or space actually have? The space between two imaginary objects is as imaginary as the objects themselves. The mass and volume of mental representations are an illusion, since they exist within a dimensionless mind. They are a part of the dream world, generated by the universal unconscious, or the demiurge. The truth is, there is no space. There's only here. The truth is, there's only now. The so-called space-time domain is an illusion, generated by the unconscious aspect of the one universal mind, and experienced by the conscious aspect of the one universal mind. The so-called frequency domain is an abstract conceptualization of the illusion, which is generated by consciousness and projected onto the unconscious in order to impose order on it and make it intelligible. The conscious aspect of mind then perceives the projections of the unconscious aspect of mind through the conceptual lens which the conscious aspect of mind unconsciously projects onto the unconscious projections of mind. And thus God looks into the mirror of his own mind and fails to recognize his own reflection. And yet the God, the mirror, and the reflection are all one. At last, the absurd doctrine of the Trinity is explained. And perhaps the mind, which perceives reality as paradox, will believe it because it's absurd. But I think anyone who looks at it the way I've described will see it the way I've described, and anyone who looks at it differently is sure to see it differently. But no matter how you look at it, it's a reflection of yourself. Be careful not to become trapped in the prison of your own mind by becoming identified with your own reflection. Don't mistake your self-concept for yourself. Don't mistake your model of reality for reality itself. Drop your self-concept. Drop your model of reality. Know reality directly. Know yourself.